For this episode, we recommend that you use headphones to fully immerse yourself in this global conversation linking Silicon Valley, Boulder, Amsterdam, and Singapore as we bring you the world's first 8D podcast series on maverick dreamers and thinkers. I'm Chloe Cho. This is part 4 as we explore what's on the other side of a post-coronavirus world. From Los Angeles, California, to Denver, Colorado, to Lansing, Michigan, where things escalated with hundreds of armed anti-lockdown protesters swarming the state capitol building as people exercise what they believe are their rights. In Europe, a wave of protests gripped Germany last weekend as thousands took to the streets from Cologne, Stuttgart, Munich, Frankfurt to Berlin, despite the easing of some coronavirus-related restrictions. Some protesters were seen using Nazi-era imagery, yellow stars which Jewish people were forced to display during the Nazi era. Smaller protests took place in other European cities including Warsaw, Zurich, Bern, Basel, and London. Police and intelligence officials warn that the rallies could be infiltrated by far-right extremists and fan anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. As tempers flare over virus-induced restrictions, how will an increasingly frustrated and weary public affect society? A new academic paper by the New York Federal Reserve concludes that deaths caused by the 1918 Spanish flu profoundly shaped German society in the following years and contributed to extremist voting in the early 1930s and strengthened the Nazi Party. The study also found a stronger correlation between influenza mortality and the vote share won by right-wing extremists in regions that had blamed minorities, in particular Jews, for medieval plagues. As the world battles a second wave of infections without a vaccine in sight, is the surge in anti-Asian racism simply a coincidence or a sign of historical parallels? As coronavirus revives age-old questions about the implications of pandemics, how will frayed nerves and tension play out in elections? At a very divisive time in the American society, how will this virus pandemic affect sentiment? Americans are heading to the polls later this year.
God, I don't know. If I had a thing that I could influence, it would be for everybody to lower the temperature on the whole political debate. I think this is a moment where, I'll speak for Americans, I don't speak globally, but for Americans, this is a moment where we should be coming together, not tearing ourselves apart. Be successful and be healthy and get over this pandemic, but do it in a way that's unifying rather than a way that's dividing. And it is a real sadness that I have as a person in their mid-50s in the United States. This is a moment where we should be able to rise together to really be unified and help each other. I have many, many people that I interact with on a daily basis that may have a different political ideology than I do. But we're all working hard together to try to solve a bunch of these problems. But the top level noise, the partisan noise and the antagonism is so distressing that I think most of the people that I interact with, we look at each other and we're like, we're not going to worry about that. We got this thing in front of us.
That's entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and author Brad Feld as he shares the challenges ahead in an election year as part of Colorado Governor Jared Polis's COVID-19 response team. As coronavirus creates grievances from virus-induced restrictions, how will such anxieties manifest as machines, AI, robotics, and other technologies are adopted to facilitate automation and remote control capabilities? Are conditions ripe for a repeat of the violent protests of the 19th century in Britain that gave rise to Luddites who were against technology for displacing jobs? Misguided fears that 5G technology's radio waves were to blame for spreading coronavirus resulted in cell phone towers getting burnt down across Europe as extremist fringe groups charged that the virus infection was manipulated to force vaccines on people as a form of control. As neo-Luddites and extremist groups emerge, the delays in rolling out 5G networks may be a good thing, according to Rob van Kranenburg, founder of the IoT Council.
In a way, that's also very good, of course, because up until now, none of this was negotiated at all. And so 5G is now running into deep trouble, of course, because it's tied in with Bill Gates and the vaccines. And there's a lot of stories, and they may go into what people call conspiracy theory stories, that 5G is also somehow involved in the virus and all of these things. So it's going to be very difficult to roll out 5G in this climate. I think that's a good thing in a way. The key is always that we want kind of a smart city, but that smart city has to be a city that people would actually want. We've seen a lot of tech push, and 5G at this moment is tech push. So, of course, we are in need of VR, AR solutions. It's quite interesting that people can operate on a patient in Shanghai when they're in Paris. Great, and we liked it. Do we want a connected car? The use case for the connected car is not the car, of course. It's the fact that anything else has to be connected. It was always a kind of trap. If you have a connected car, it means that you have basically every object connected. The connected lantern pole, the connected road, the connected trash can, the connected whatever. Because without those, you cannot have connected cars. So it was never about the connected car. The connected car was always about pushing technology into everything. And the principles that we're coming out with soon on disposable identities.
Civil liberties may be a thing of the past as contact tracing becomes a reality in a growing number of countries to deal with the second wave of infections, even though the technology to anonymize personal data is readily available, according to AI expert and data scientist David Hardoon, whose many roles have included serving as Chief Data Officer of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the de facto central bank.
We also have the technology for the anonymization, for keeping privacy in check. But you see, the challenge with all technology, and especially the one of AI, because it's about the world of probabilities, it's about the world of likelihoods. It isn't about the world of certainty. And this is where sometimes things become a bit conflicted because, well, whether deliberately or unknowingly, policies at times is written in the words of absolute. So the moment you're saying that you cannot have the ability of identifying an individual, no technology out there can give you an absolute guarantee of not being able to re-identify an individual. There may be a 0.0001% probability. So we need to have a bit of leniency from a policy perspective, as long as the risk is a acceptable, marginal, insignificant risk, we can go ahead with the anonymized data, the encrypted data, because there's a very low risk of identifying an individual, rather than saying, no, there should be no ability of identifying an individual effectively. And secondly, is we also need to be a bit more tolerant ourselves as individuals. There needs to be this fluidity effectively. And there needs to be a degree of assurance that how the data is used is only used in this period of necessity.
You think that'll work out the trade-off between people who are fighting for and against privacy and what to do with contact tracing?
Absolutely. Look, in the end of the day, we all have to be pragmatic. I am an advocate of innovation. I'm an advocate of using AI and data. I'm concurrently an advocate of privacy. I'm an advocate of ethics. But there needs to be pragmatism. There needs to be a way of seeing the world in between. Is one's privacy worth the cost of another's life? That is an exceptionally difficult question, but I would say, well, we need to be a bit more lenient by saying that, yes, we need to adhere to privacy. We need to make sure there is a certain robustness that we will always lean towards. So it's having a bit of both worlds to a certain extent. For example, we freely give our privacy, our information away to Google to tell us whether to turn left or right when we're driving a car. So in recommendations on Netflix, when we buy stuff on Amazon, when Alexa or Siri give us recommendations. So these are things which we are doing right now without giving it too much thought, but we hadn't done it on the medical, governmental, management and mitigation level. I would like to take a more positive approach towards it by saying, just let us learn. Let us learn that these technologies are in place. They are not theoretical. They are very much already in use. Let's use these technologies on things that truly impact our lives. And again, if I go back to my early analogies, that if you ask me, David, are you willing to sacrifice some extent of your privacy in order to save lives? Just like I'm willing to sacrifice a bit of my privacy to have better directions in when I drive my car, I think the answer is yes.
David notes that desperate times call for desperate measures so as to mitigate a highly infectious virus while advances in artificial intelligence and data analytics are underway.
There are millions of unknown strains that are out there, and I mean, let's hope that the more violent ones do never come our way. But I think we are, in every case, in every situation, we learn. We have to learn. And I think we are better than when N1H1 was around. We were better from SARS, we're better from MERS, and all the many ones that have come before this. And I think the learnings that have come from this one need to help us on the future pandemic and what needs to be done, both in terms of identification, in terms of acknowledgement, if I may say, because once you hit a pandemic, we may like to believe we have control, that we have sovereignty. Unfortunately, viruses don't abide by any law or any sovereignty. So how do we very quickly put politics aside and deal with the situation? How do we mitigate it? How do we share information openly, putting aside whatever geopolitical conflicts or disagreements we have in place?
In this day and age where AI, robotics, machine learning, all of these things are at the most advanced stage that humankind has ever known. So from where you sit, how could COVID-19 have been better managed by leveraging all that the world knows?
You see, this is one of those moments of the power of hindsight. Now, we have the technology, we have the capabilities, and definitely from an AI-centric or machine learning or data science point of view, it was more of a case of a challenge that the framework or the policy or the enablement of using it or truly using it wasn't entirely there because of rightful privacy concerns and cross-border. But to really emphasize it, there is the possibility. In fact, if you think about it, we're all accustomed to the hyper-personalization of what you want before you even know you want it. And ultimately, COVID-19 or any other kind of virus is a pattern. And what AI specializes in is about the ability of identifying patterns and giving indications or recommendations of what to do with them.
This is where Jessica Groopman, founding partner of Kaleido Insights, disagrees. Even among AI experts, views differ on the extent of AI application and its capabilities in a crisis situation.
AI and automation generally does lack and has a lot of limitations that humans are still far superior at. So in some ways, perhaps the future of work will really shift to different kinds of skills where machines and AI and automation are simply just not to the task. I mentioned tacit knowledge as one example of kind of applying the experience in things that cannot be codified. This is where we specialize: emotional intelligence, negotiation, social intelligence, and so forth. But certainly, yes, this accelerates those existing tensions in a really overt and extreme way.
How could we have done things better? Based on my conversation with another AI expert, AI is not able to predict events, but using data, using patterns that you can share the data to warn other countries, to warn other infected patients about what not to do. Therefore, this kind of sharing can be done at a much faster rate versus people just poring over each and every document.
I would maybe slightly push back and say that AI can predict, obviously, depending on the complexity of the situation. So naturally, things like COVID-19 are far more complex, and hence the predictability of it is a lot more challenging. But where it can be used a lot more effectively is really on the detection and then the management. So think about it. If you look at the first officially recorded case in Wuhan, the curves, the approach, and the way in which infection has been happening has been largely the same around the world. It's like every country has been, to a certain extent, replicating what the previous country has been done, subject, of course, to the slightly difference in demographics and culture. Now, As I mentioned earlier, that's exactly where AI is powerful. It's about learning those patterns. So if a country, unfortunately, in this case was China, was the first to be hit, it had the opportunity, and we have the opportunity in leveraging all that data and understanding the spread, understanding susceptibility and the risk likelihood of individuals to COVID-19, and using that information by sharing it cross-border, cross-country, such that other countries that are now entering into that curve are able to better manage that situation rather than just simply repeating it.
Leveraging the experience and data is precisely how PatSnap, an AI data platform specializing in intellectual property analytics, dealt with the turmoil as the shockwaves of lockdown spread across business lines. When PatSnap's offices with 500 staff across 4 cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou were forced to shut down, PatSnap CEO and founder Jeffrey Tiong decided to set up a digital war room.
Our China office first experienced the lockdown in end of January, early February. So the first thing is to find all our employees and ensure everyone is safe. After that, we actually set up a war room. We will meet every single day. In fact, we set up a WeChat group as well to ensure everyone is keeping in touch all the time. So with the war room, and then we start strategizing and plan what to do with this. As the situation continue to unfold, we know that government will enforce a lockdown throughout the country. So we start planning for that and also start sourcing for face masks for all our employees. And after the whole lockdown, about 3 to 4 weeks in China, when everyone start coming back to work, we actually also have them to come back to work in phases, in different phases and stages. We also supply face masks to all of our employees in China every day. We also measure their temperature every day as well. And actually those temperature will be logged into the system on the app in China. And we intend to apply the similar measure to our Western counterparts office as well.
Overseeing the situation from Singapore, where PatSnap has an R&D center, Jeffrey says the experience in China was invaluable in helping PatSnap's other offices across Asia, Europe, and North America as the crisis spread with little guidance available.
Because of our China experience, we managed to, I would say, a little bit of heads up this time. So when the same thing happened to our London office, to our Toronto office, to our Singapore office as well, we do the same thing as I also sharing this experience we have in China with our Western colleague. I'm glad that everyone also rise up to it, and we managed to do that much more effectively this time.
PatSnap supposedly has a weatherproof business model. It's about intellectual property, related data, and managing that, turning that into a snap. So patents in a snap. Are you surprised that your businesses were affected by a virus pandemic?
Yes, definitely. You're right that it's either good time or bad time. I think people will continue to invest in R&D. In fact, based on the data we have from Second World War since 1940s until now, every year, R&D investment continue to grow. It's just by 3%, by 5%, or by 6%. So we are confident that in the mid to long term, this will not impact our business. In the short term, it does. There's a lot of uncertainty on the market. It makes the whole sales process more difficult. In fact, a lot of things internal, our go-to-market, will have to adapt to it as well.
So is the market completely frozen? What's the impact on revenues? If go-to-market is not happening, if sales are not happening?
I won't say the market completely frozen. Fortunately for our space, actually the last couple of days in Europe, in US, we still have customers signing up our services. But definitely the whole sales cycle is longer. The conversion rate is lower as well.
Looking at the way forward, as economies, as nations scramble to reopen businesses, how do you think the business landscape will change post-coronavirus? You open up your terminal, you see what companies are doing, you see the kind of patents that they are posting. Do you think that there is a greater shift towards certain sectors, certain technologies?
Things will definitely not go back to where it was since China has lifted off the lockdown. Things definitely have changed, even though now everyone can move freely across most of the country and they can go out just like normal days now. I think the activity has definitely impacted. A lot of them, in fact, the business activities has still dropped, hasn't gone back to the pre-COVID-19. So that definitely is one change. The other is remote working. So most of them actually start getting used to remote working from home. There are benefits to that. Things still continue to unfold even in China. I would call this a new norm.
What exactly is the new norm? As coronavirus continues to increase the human toll and economic damage, what unfolds before our eyes may be a world of contrasts. For example, contrary to the economic misery inflicted by the virus, global financial markets have rallied, bouncing off sharply from mid-March lows, and Wall Street is in a bull market not far from its all-time highs. Here's David Williams, founder and CEO of Williams Capital Advisors, on why.
If it weren't for the actions of the government, this would lead to a stock market rout of unprecedented proportions. The reason that it hasn't is because the Fed cut to zero so quickly, and the U.S. government has essentially pledged almost unlimited support. I suspect that'll probably go to 10 trillion plus over a number of months and quarters. But the real issue here is demand, and the demand it's going to improve when the lockdowns are over, but it's not going to get anywhere close to the levels that it was at for many, many quarters to come. I think what you've got here is a problem where the government is doing everything in their power to basically, every time you see a hole, a spring, a leak in the dike, they go ahead and put their finger in the dike to try to plug that hole, whether that's protecting airlines or whether it's protecting the restaurant industry, and now you're talking about the oil industry. But ultimately, they're not going to get every hole out there. There's going to be all sorts of companies and industries that fall between the cracks. When you have this kind of supply-demand imbalance, not just in oil, but in almost every business out there, you have a recession. There's no way to avoid it, and the question is just how deep and how long.
Just as central bank action has created a disconnect between equity valuations and dismal economic realities on the ground, the dichotomic picture is something that may play out in other industries in this era of a strange new normal.
Because of the Fed's actions and the Congress's actions, the public stock market is very high. I mean, it's not all that far off of its all-time highs. And so you're not going to be getting as many discounts or as deep discounts as you normally would in a recession, let alone a recession this deep, in the public market. But what you are seeing in the private markets are much more opportunities. I would say it's less a function of industry, more of which market is less inflated by government action right now. The Fed put is essentially, I think we can be reasonably assured that the stock market won't drop 50% plus as it probably would have from the peak if they hadn't gotten so involved, because I think if the market were to fall anywhere close to that level, the Fed might actually step in and buy equities, as the Central Bank of Japan has done. Individual stocks are going to get hammered when they come out and announce earnings. I think we've got multiple quarters of brutal pain, and that probably stretches into early next year.
The economy is always based on confidence, right? We spend based on how confident we are about today and the future. So certainly the plunging of markets and the extreme uncertainty into kind of what comes next in terms of paying my rent, what comes next in terms of the election, what comes next in that near, mid, and long term is extremely unclear at the government level, at the corporate level, at financial markets. It's just very unclear.
From global equities that have rallied through some of the worst economic data in recorded history to panic buying that has emptied supermarket shelves, the strange new normal has seen food prices going up as global supply chains take a hit. Even slaughterhouses and meat handling facilities have had to close or slow down their operations, making food sovereignty a critical concern for a rising number of countries. For a wealthy island nation like Singapore that imports 90% of what it consumes to feed its near 6 million population, The pandemic has underscored the importance of food security, according to John Friedman, Asia Director of AgFunder, a food and agri-tech venture capital platform.
What COVID has exposed and highlighted is that there's so much more to understanding the complete sort of supply chain questions and challenges that we try to look at across the agri-food system. And to your point about Singapore focusing on food security, I found it fascinating that just last year, just over 12 months ago, the government announced this bold ambition to grow 30% of our produce locally, compared to sort of average of about 10% right now is grown and consumed in Singapore, and we rely on 90% of food imports. The government set out this 30 by 30 target to produce 30% of our domestic needs by the year 2030. That's obviously been drawn into focus now in this COVID world, with supply chain disruption raising the alarm bells and red flags around, well, what happens if your neighbor like Malaysia shuts the borders and we can't access our leafy vegetables? The focus has really shifted towards the question of sustainable supply chains, and I guess packaged in that security question as opposed to simple considerations about population growth and consumption profiles.
As coronavirus complicates food chain logistics, sales of plant-based meat substitutes have shot up. Unlike real meat that relies on labor, plant-based protein is more automated, so less vulnerable to manpower shortages, and its supply chain factors are easier to manipulate. For now, it's doubtful that plant-based protein will be seen as a real game changer, as it accounts for a small portion of the meat market and fund flows are not yet materializing in agri-tech or food tech.
The total investment dollar that went into agri-food startups, I think, was just shy of 20 billion, and that was down from about 21 billion in 2018. Obviously, that is, as you pointed out, reflective of the broader pullback in the venture capital industry as a whole. The interest and activity that we're seeing at earlier stage, we're talking sort of seed and Series A, Series B, continues to pick up, recognizing that there's increasing participation by bright entrepreneurs wanting to make a difference and create solutions for this space. Valuation frothiness, perhaps, which gripped pretty much the entire market before this year's sort of market correction. But in terms of absolute activity and the number of investors we're seeing entering, and the absolute sort of deal size in terms of the amount of engagement and the number of deals, and that continues to increase.
Do you see a clear difference between before this coronavirus crisis hit and after, as people witness empty shelves and a run on toilet paper worldwide?
There's been a lot of pivoting taking place, at least in terms of early stage startups related to anywhere from, say, the biotech space to manufacturing space. Obviously, a lot of companies, public and private, are trying to respond and pivot their manufacturing lines and development to address the needs of COVID. In terms of whether or not COVID has had an impact on investment in this sector, no doubt. I think in terms of willingness for investors to cut checks, more on, I would say, from the sort of angel side, not necessarily from the institutional side, there is a fair reluctance at this point to be deploying capital. I think it's too early to tell what the ultimate impact will be on the sector.
While groundbreaking solutions may not be coming fast enough for an increasingly frustrated public, the pandemic is bringing about change. Whether it's food tech, agri-tech, edu-tech, or telehealth, entrepreneurs and businesses are trying to imagine a way out of this crisis through technological innovation and creative destruction.
There's a question happening that is really, really profound when it comes to the application and innovation of technology, which is why? What is the purpose of this technology? Why would we build it? And I say that this is so important because historically, much of the innovation, certainly that has come out of where I live, Silicon Valley, has been around optimizing ad spend, targeting for advertising and behavioral modifications around consumerism. Great. But that fundamental question of why are we doing this and what is the purpose of this technology, this offers a profound and universal to new context to that question of, as we talked about earlier, what are we designing the tool for? A tool in and of itself is not a solution. So much depends on the intentions of the designers and the engineers. And so I think that this, perhaps bottom up, is one shift that I'm hearing a lot about from corporations and folks building these technologies. This need for collaboration, this need for standardization, for coordination across technologies, both in terms of its opportunities, as we need now, but also in terms of its potential risks. This is essential, and it's not going away anytime soon. It was well underway and obvious pre-coronavirus, and in many ways, this only underscores the need for that.
How should we look at the world differently? How do we redesign ourselves to accommodate the strange new normal? And what are the solutions at hand? Stay tuned for Part 5 as our global conversation linking North America, Europe, and Asia continues next week as we thank AI and data scientist David Hardoon, Jeffrey Tiong, CEO and founder of PatSnap, John Friedman, Asia Director of AgFunder, David Williams of Williams Cap Advisors, Jessica Groopman of Kaleido Insights, Rob Van Kranenburg of the IoT Council, and Brad Feld of Foundry Group. And I'm Chloe Cho. Join us next week on Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers. Thank you so much for tuning in.